Okay, we're streaming, everybody. We're live. Hello, everybody, and a special welcome to my ArtSci Technology Desmond 9 students. I am so pleased to introduce Joel Ong, who is a self-identified serial collaborator. I love how you say that about yourself. I'm not sure when we met because it's been a long time, but it was at DX Arts. And can you tell me the year? That's what I thought. I thought it's 13. But so 2012, I went to DX Arts to do a critique of students' work, graduate students, at the invitation of Eddie Shankin, who's an art historian. And he told me to specifically talk to Joel because of his interest in nanotech and his background in biology. And of course, I did, and I was just immediately so impressed that we continued to be in contact, and then we collaborated on Project Birdsong Diamond, being one with Dr. Charles Taylor. He also taught in our SciArt summer program, and basically is part of the ArtSci Collective, which is a group of us from all over who have been in touch, as you see, for many years. So we met in the year of the dragon or something, I'm not sure, something like that. Anyway, so very briefly about Joel. As I mentioned, his background is in biology, where he studied biology in Singapore, the National University there. And then he got his PhD at DX Arts. Another thing to mention is that he was a resident at Symbiotica, which is the very first lab that's an artist lab in a biology department in the University of Australia in Perth. And they made many groundbreaking projects as artists in biotech labs. So that's Ionat Zur and Eran Katz. They really did a lot of work with tissue culture, critical work, so really interesting, thought-provoking work. He was also resident at Coalesce, which is at the University of Buffalo under Paul Manus, who's also an artist working with biotech and doing really important work. Actually, he just came out with a book that I'll link for everybody. So to just say that this is part of our Pacific Standard Time series where we invite artists who are participating in our project that's called Atmosphere of Sound, Sonic Arts in Times of Climate Disruption. And Pacific Standard Time is a Getty initiative that is involving many institutions around Los Angeles, and it will happen in September, open in September, and then go throughout the year. When we were thinking about the artists who would be part of what we're envisioning, which is really bringing sound and listening and thinking about the environment in a more elemental way, that is more of a kind of a cellular, energetic listening, of listening that is not necessarily about hearing, I immediately thought of Joel. And he was like the first on my list because he actually, as you will see, works with atmosphere. The title is almost like something he would write. And he's very involved with thinking about sensing, using technologies that scientists and the acoustic engineers use in really interesting ways to engage audiences. And most of all, he's also interested in not only bringing pedagogy into it, but also community. So it's a very expansive way of artistic practice that I really appreciate and respect. And so I would like you to give him a very warm welcome. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you for having me. I want to say that this journey with the UCLA ArtSci Center has been a really, really long and fruitful one. And up here, I had to put this. This is a picture of Max Kazamzada, Victoria, myself, and John Bromley outside Times Square in 2015, where we were setting up the Birdsong Diamond. I'll leave you to find out more about that project. I'm not going to speak too much about it, but I do want to put this out here because I think it's an opportune moment to explain how pivotal this experience and Victoria has been in my academic career. What she did not mention was when she came to DxArts, as a grad student, I was in a bit of a hole. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. I was a scientist, as she has mentioned before, and I was in an arts program, and so I was very much, a newbie into a lot of the thinking that artists had. And I really felt like I didn't fit. And when she came and she invited me to be part of this team, a lot changed for me. And I want to say that, especially in this scenario where you have the chance now to be mentored by people around you, look no further than your own faculty. So you're in good hands, that's what I want to say, and thank you, Victoria, for all your mentorship all these years. We are also both born in the year of the pig, right? Okay, so a little bit of thing there. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a little bit about myself very, very briefly, and then I want to take a deep dive into some of the works that I've been thinking about. There are many sides to my art practice, and this is one of them, and I hope that if you're interested, you might go to my website and check out some of them. And if you have any questions, which undoubtedly might come up, you could just email me at any point. I'll be happy to talk more, happy to learn more about your projects as well. I'm an associate professor now in the Department of Computational Arts. I used to direct Sensorium, the Center for Digital Art and Technology at York University in Toronto, where we are focusing on expanded practices of media in multiple environments, including virtual reality. Right now, I am the Helen Carswell Chair in Community Engaged Research in the Arts. A lot of my work involves the community groups around York itself. So, I've been talking a lot with people that are in our hyperlocal community. So that's something that you probably are interested in as well. Why are you here at UCLA? Why are you in this particular part of the world? And what can you do? What kind of impact can you have? Not so much on a global scale, that will come eventually, but right now, right here, what can you do in your hyperlocal environment? That's stuff that I'm very interested in. I also run the faculty's makerspace, and we do a lot of things, including exhibitions that kind of probe at this emerging, division or lack of division between art and technology, and of course, its impact on our daily and everyday lives as well. There's a lot of fabrication involved in that, but we call it a kind of remixing, right? It's almost like you're scratching as a DJ. So some images just to pique your interest about some of the works that I will talk about, but also some of the projects that I'm invested in. Just kind of shout out to the Birdsong Diamond team, top middle. This is their Ars Electronica set, which I wasn't part of setting up, but I was involved in making the system for the bird call. Birdsong mimic system, sorry, not bird call. Okay, I will start my talk officially now, okay? So naming this talk Memory Machines is kind of important for me because I'm interested in considering memory as an act of constant production, both in the inscription of events and how it kind of enters your mind as a database, but also in its recall. So it's a way for us to consider the determinists and formulas and systemic impulses and naming something a machine. What does a machine do? What is our relationship to machines and why do we make them, right? So I want to put into tension this idea that the databases and systems that are available now don't really happen in a very fixed and static way, and they are mostly dynamic. They are created through flux, unpredictability, and when we recall certain things, especially, you guys know if you recall memories of your past, they'll all be a little fuzzy. So every single time you recall a memory, it's almost like you're reliving a different alternate reality altogether. And I want to posit that digital databases are like that as well. So I'm very interested in the ways that the environment, elemental media, is becoming seen more and more as a database. How can you start to inscribe stories, narratives, experiences, movements in a way through the in the environment? And so these are all these different elements of the wind, water, things that make up like the tone or ambience. So it's interesting that we're looking actually at a picture of clouds, right? And obviously, you know, this is synthetic. You can see some grid structure at the base. This was made in Unity. It's interesting because the very idea of looking up and thinking about clouds and the sky as an expansive space, every time you see a poster that advertises a form of freedom, you always see blue skies, birds flying around. But it's also interesting and very sobering to think about the kinds of interventions that humans are making on the environment, particularly the skies as well. And this is a project called Cloud Atlas Beta, where I was interested in the aesthetics or the changing aesthetics of clouds in the face of aggressive geoengineering and cloud modification. There's a little bit more of a backstory to that. But the main idea of putting this here is to think about clouds, you know, as this idea of an expandless database. The sky as this kind of expanded space of freedom, being geopoliticized, being intervened upon. You know, every time we look up into the sky and we kind of look at these clouds, there will come a time where these are all essentially customized or you know, man-made. And what happens to our tone or our ambience? And what happens to you know, storms when they come and they function as as part of the whims and fancies of human intervention. Okay, so on the subject of memory, all right? So in his book, An Anthropologist on Mars, Oliver Sacks, you guys know Oliver Sacks? This is really a very interesting writer. He has this book called something about his wife mistaking him for a hat, right? You remember that's the classic one. And he talks about these really interesting, sometimes humorous instances when he's patients and he's a psychologist, but also like a brain scientist. Sometimes lesions in the brain construct very different realities for his patients. And so he writes about some of those, and they're really interesting. And in this story, he talks about a painter called Franco Magnani. He's from a small little town in Italy called Pontito. And this guy, because of a little bit of a lesion in his brain, he's able to reproduce with photographic accuracy every nuance of his hometown. Every building, every street, every stone, even this place that he hasn't seen for like 30 years, right? So it's really interesting to learn that when he finally went back to his hometown and he saw that all these places were in different shades of disarray, he stopped painting almost entirely for a period of time. And when he finally picked up the courage again to start painting, he started to paint these pictures of his hometown somewhat floating in space. The paradox, right, is the insistence that Franco the artist would always be staying away or never returning to his hometown in order to continue painting. So this science fiction landscape was almost like a way for him to conserve his memory and to literally kind of remove it from the face of the earth so it would survive in an unfamiliar or alien environment so that the tendrils, if you will, of the world would not corrupt or taint it. And sometimes that's what we think about when we think about memory. So there's a psychologist, David Wayman, who speaks about nostalgia as this notion of crystallization of memory. And the fact that, you know, once it's crystallized like this, you know, you don't really access it. And that's not really how it works, right? So it's interesting that these crystals also are what creates clouds. And so this juxtaposition has some meaning in it. I want to think a little bit about my own memories before I jump into my projects. I'm a first generation settler in Canada. I live in Takaronto in Canada, but I'm of Chinese and Southeast Asian descent. So my parents are second generation Singaporean, and my great grandmother was actually the first person who moved down from the Fujian province down into Singapore. And it was interesting because she has bound feet. But at that point, females who, as part of the Chinese diaspora, would usually work in kitchens or be laborers. And so she was actually, even with bound feet, she was actually one of these laborers called Hong Do Ting, which is like they used to wear this red cap. And she would work in the shipyards just to make a living. And I kind of have this lineage of women in my family and in my life being very strong. So I've benefited a lot from that. Ironically, my mom is not in this picture, but I also put this out because I grew up, as a musician, and we've talked a little bit about machines being formalistic and systemic. And in this picture, my sister and I are playing Edelweiss on a recorder. In Singapore, recorders are like the way you access music as a kid. Okay, everyone has to learn them, but they are very strict about the song that you learn, and you have to learn it exactly the way it is. And so we're trying to play Edelweiss, and my brother, who you can kind of see in the foreground, because he's young, he's just like blasting away whatever it is that he wants. And in the midst of this cacophony, my dad is trying to sing a song, right? Whether it was Edelweiss, I don't know. So, there is this idea also about like the way that we're listening to things and the way that we generate these. And when I think back about this, I think about it as a formative moment in my life where I kind of realized that there is rigidity to some of the patterns and information that we learn in our lives. But then there's also this kind of inference or making sense of it, which doesn't really have to be systemic and rigid. It can be free, it can be humorous. It can be like whatever my dad's doing, trying to make meaning out of nothing. But it's really about doing it together. So again, Victoria's talked a lot about being in a band together, and sometimes I think back to this when she says it, and I go like, I think I was in a family band when I was young. Just you might not like the music, but I think, we did something together. Okay. So one last statement is that, one of the motivations coming from the sciences, again, where the sciences is all like, yes, we know how to solve the world, don't worry, so what do you as artists do? You're like, what? And it's almost something that I felt that I had come home when I got to Canada. So, Canada, like, unlike many other places in the world, actually places a huge emphasis on research creation as a very valid mode of knowledge creation, just like in the sciences. And so Natalie Lovelace from Queen's, in her book called How to Make Art at the End of the World, a Manifesto for Research Creation, talks about the arts as being an important and overlooked part of these kind of end time scenarios, because they offer mode of sensuous aesthetic tuning is a very important thing, and work as a conduit to focus attention, elicit public discourse, and shape cultural imaginaries. And she asks, how might the world be organized differently? That's really what we're here for, provide these different options of how might this world be organized differently. Okay, I'm just going to skip that one. So this was one of the first projects that I worked on in earnest. And Victoria mentioned I was from Symbiotica in the University of Western Australia. And I was very interested to think about listening in a different sense. I had just come out from biology, and I was very interested in biosymbiotics, how animals communicate with each other, how signaling mechanisms kind of indicate like mating structures. You know all these in the way that the bees form. My claim to fame actually was that I was working with fiddler crabs. So I could have become a fiddler crab guy, but I didn't. And I would have eaten most of them anyway. But when I got to Western Australia, this was about the time where vital materialism was kind of coming to the foreground. Everybody was trying to understand, what is it that ties us all together? What is this vibrant reality, material reality that we are living within? And so Peter Sloterdijk, actually, this atmospheric theorist, has this interesting quote, which I kind of ask myself periodically. He asks, he says, "Tell me what you are immersed in, and I'll tell you what you are," which is kind of interesting because not only does it seem like, basically where I choose to be is who I'm going to become, but it also implies that you're always in communication with this environment, whether it's atmospheric, whether it's built environment, whether it's outdoors, whether it's indoors, you're always kind of in that environment. So the medium becomes you that you immerse yourself in, right? But then it also kind of asks the question, like, who's actually constructing this medium? The stuff that I'm mired within, like who actually owns it, right? And who's controlling different parts of it, aspects of it. So these are ideas that I kind of think about. But at that point in Perth, I was really interested in seeing what is the sound and what's the vibrant nature that you are part of. So I created these series of conceptual scores. This is one of them called Nano Noise, where it's for urban soundscape, microphone and imagination, where you're just supposed to imagine the whole world vibrating and then go out and listen to it. I was very inspired by Yoko Ono at that point also. And this is definitely one way to finish your assignments really, really fast. Okay, that's a joke. That's facetious. Do not take that advice. But I also was wondering, as a kind of thesis, what would the world sound like if you were small enough to stand on an eardrum? Like, what would it be? And so that actually was really interesting because the eardrum vibrates at nanoscale amplitudes. And so in order to find out what that nano amplitude sounded like, I had to go into a nanochemistry lab. And so I did a residency in a nanochemistry lab in Curtin University. I got trained to be an AFM technician, so I could do all this work on this independently. But I also did some separate experiments in the lab where I was just vibrating membranes just to see what it would look like under the microscope. And it turns out that these are really interesting processes. At the end of my time in Symbiotica, what we ended up doing was to get a silk fibroin membrane. And this is a membrane that you usually put on your eardrum when you have a perforation. It's really, really funny, the kinds of materials that they were using, like sticky tape, pigskin, all sorts of stuff. And they settled at some point on silk fibroin, which is then seeded with HTMKs, which are human tympanic membrane keratinocytes. Basically the skin that's covering your eardrums, they would seed it on the silk fibroin membrane. And that's a good sign? Okay, it's back. Okay. They would seed it on the silk fibroin membrane and then put it back in your ear, right? And then it would grow over and the silk would dissolve and you would have a full repaired eardrum. So at the end of my experiment, I actually got one of these things, seeded it with HTMKs, and then put it under the atomic force microscope. And if you know what that is, if you've probably been to CNSI, they have some really beautiful machines over there. It is this little cantilever that has a triangular tip that is about 5 or 6 nanometers wide, and you lay it down on your sample, and as the sample vibrates, this cantilever would vibrate, and then it will create a reading in your microscope, in your machine. So if you think about it, it's actually dropping an antenna into a very vibrant medium, and then just listening to it, right? So the atomic force microscope usually, ironically, gives back a signal in an image, but I was interested in saying, okay, well, why don't we just listen to it since we can? And there was something that was also very interesting at that time. I started learning about spontaneous autoacoustic emissions. And if you don't know, and if you've ever gone for a hearing test, what happens is they shoot a pulse of sound into your eardrum, and then they record the sound that comes back. So when your eardrum is met with particular frequencies of sound, it actually generates its own sound. So the ear doesn't just listen, it actually also creates. And this fact of turning the ear back on itself and kind of listening to the ear in the process of listening was the circularity which I was really interested in at that time. So there's a short video here. This was the teaser. It's a longer one, maybe on Vimeo, but just bury my butt. Sorry, it was a bad angle. So we moved the AFM out of the nanochemistry lab to a gallery space. Can you imagine the insurance liability on that one? At that time, yeah, not now. So as you can imagine, if I'm piping the sound directly into a space and it's listening to it, the microphone is right there next to the speaker, it's gonna feedback, right? So as I was so-called performing with the eardrum, all I was doing was controlling these different frequency bands on a manual filter just to make sure it wouldn't spike. But I was also kind of creating different tones with this interaction. So it's fun. You know, I used to talk about this as a collaboration across scales, like through this tunnel that you're looking down into the nanoscale, and you're creating sound that's actually audible on a human scale. Okay. Yeah, amplify it actually, because it's already vibrating at a hearing range. Yeah, just really have to speed it. This is an audification, yeah, so just literally pure raw sound. In fact, we started off trying to sonify it, so we got that sound and then we tried to do a lot of manipulation with it. At some point, we just decided we would take an output from a VC output from the breakout box of the actual laser in the microscope and then just plug it directly to an amp. And that's what came out. Yeah. So at that time, I was also interested in this profound moment for cochlear implantees. As you can think about, these kinds of feedback mechanisms, things about the ear, and hearing in the open environment is quite a very complex phenomenon. As you guys might know, if you have a cochlear implant, or if you know somebody who has a cochlear implant, what they basically do is they separate environmental noise or environmental sounds into different bandwidths. And to tune your cochlear implant, they put you in a room and then they go into these different bands and they play a tone in there and you just say louder or softer, louder or softer, louder or softer, louder or softer. And you have to do that tuning session periodically. So I was interested in, trying to navigate that out in an open space. So I had this gallery that was willing to have me in there for a residency, and I so-called tuned the room to 6 pitches that were the resonant frequencies of the room. And I had these roving Roombas that were hacked, and they all have a microphone on it, so they feedback when they go close to the speakers. For me, it was a system of kind of tuning yourself to the environment and mimic to a certain extent the tonotopicity of a cochlear implant tune-up session. Okay, this is called Wagon. I don't know why. And I began becoming really interested also in expanding this into the environment. You know, if you could hear sound that's so microscopic, so nanoscopic, what about sounds in the environment? How could you actually hear them through different kinds of means? In LA, you have an amazing museum called the Museum of Jurassic Technology. Anybody's been there? Yeah? Okay, so if you go there, you will find a small miniature version of this Athanasius Kircher listening device. So it's at the bottom. They might actually have both of these there, but they're kind of really tiny. But these were drawings that Athanasius Kircher, who was a 16th century Jesuit priest, 17th century Jesuit priest, used to come up with because he wanted to hear what the wind was saying. Prior to this, you didn't have any musical instruments that would take sound from the environment and amplify it this way. So he had a series of different contraptions, and the most popular one and the one that survived all this time, probably you guys should know of this, is the Aeolian harp. Right? So the Aeolian harp basically is a harp that's stretched across a window, for instance, or kind of stretched out in the open space. And when the wind blows through it, it has these haunting tones that are caused by harmonics that go longitudinally and not just latitudinally, longitudinal resonances. And he was really interested in extracting sounds as much as he could. He wanted to listen to them, you know. But at the same time, he also wanted to be able to communicate with it. And so he also had this, which I think, it doesn't show up very well, but I think this was one of the most important innovations, I think, that he came up with, which was to propose these human Aeolian ensembles where you could actually have a musician in that space, and out in the courtyard you would place these Aeolian harps, and these musicians would play with the wind. And this was proposed in 1673. It's amazing. And because he was a Jesuit priest as well, there's this idea that he was actually trying to communicate quite physically or abstractly with God. So this is something I think about a lot as well. You know, I have a practice as a musician as well. I play with a lot of different people, and I play with people with a lot of different spiritual backgrounds. And here, this is a improvisation that I've done with Archer Pacharis, who's a Cree indigenous drummer from Toronto also. And so we think a lot about spirituality and sound and how we can actually formulate that into a collaborative experience. Okay, I'm gonna move on. Oh, okay. All right, okay. So, switch gears a little bit, just for a minute. Anybody heard of the writer Italo Calvino? Yep, you probably, if you have, you probably know of his work, Invisible Cities. Okay, so Invisible Cities is a book. It's actually a really short book. If you haven't read it, it's really an easy read. But it has 55 different descriptions of cities that don't exist. Or they are fictitious, right? They're imagined. And the story goes that Kublai Khan, who was a conqueror, and he had conquered many lands, he really wanted to know more about these lands that he had conquered. And so he asked Marco Polo to go to each of them and send him a description of each of them. So these were the 55 cities that Marco Polo visited, and they sent it back, and he was narrating these to Kublai Khan. But the interesting thing about them is that as he's narrating, you see these motifs that are repeated. And then you see certain parts of it that just don't seem like they fit. Like suddenly in one of them, there's like, something that resembles another city almost entirely. You know, this mirror structure is there, and then this mirror structure is here too as well. And you can attribute it to Calvino being, the kind of writer he is. There's also one city, this is something you have to find, but there's also one city that has an aeroplane in it. And you're like, what? But it's Italo Calvino, okay? He does these cuts, and then you go, whoa, where am I? But the proposition in this book is that Marco Polo went to all of these different cities, and his memory of these cities merged so much with his memories of his hometown, Venice, that he started to write about Venice in all of them. So whether that's true or not, we don't really know. But it started me thinking, could we actually have a kind of similarity in interests? Could this kind of build our construction of a place, of a particular geography? And so I thought I would map it out. So in this first picture, for each of these 55 cities, I came up with 5 keywords, and I ran it through a Twitter feed. And Twitter at that point, this is going to date me, right? But Twitter was like the thing, okay? And I geolocated them, and I just created this diagram. And so I did it for all 55, and you start seeing these really interesting densities that came up. And so I filtered them for the keywords, but I started thinking, Marco Polo thought about Venice because Venice was his home, and Kublai Khan had kind of pulled him out of that restful state and brought him to wherever it is that he brought him to in his kingdom. What if we were to ask people what their recollections or their keywords of their homes were? Could we find a similar kind of structure within this flux of the internet flows, within this, kind of like phantasmagoria of communication on the internet? So I basically set about asking people to this gallery space, and actually a month before that I was asking people and send them a Google form going like, what are 5 things that you remember of your home? And so, like if you were to ask me, a lot of it will revolve around food, traffic, maybe it's humid in Singapore when I was growing up, so it's humidity. Like my family is really important, and so was music. So like, that'd be my 5, right? But it turns out a lot of people also have the same kind of ideas, right? And so being able to start to weave them together for me was really interesting. So I would run these keywords across like a Twitter feed, and for a month I would get all the geolocated tweets. You'd be able to get that easily with one of these APIs nowadays. And then when they were close to each other, they would basically grow a kind of block for each of these particular positions. So then at the end of it, you get a city. And so what I did was for every person respondent to this project, I created a small city. And I said, this is home. And your home is warm and fresh pressed laundry, basically whatever. And I would create this, and wherever they were in the world, I would endeavor to deliver this to them. And for me, this was one way where you could visualize home as a collective representation of ideas. But it was also for me to gift a memoir of home to somebody. And so I part of the journey of me going to return these or to present the people with this was also important to me. Mary was one of them, actually. Mary Magic, yeah. So it was hard to track her down, but yeah. So I just continued a bit with this Twitter thing and kind of the visualization and trying to understand where the poetics of this might be. This was a piece that was done visualizing or more like creating a tidalscape from Twitter words. So I would note the occurrence of tweets that had the word, I think, one of it was sunk or lost, and one of it was found. Yeah, lost and found. So they would create a tidalscape that I would then kind of take a trend line between the two, and that would be the tides that would control an installation that would move from being underwater to above ground, underwater to above ground. And this was closely related to the story of Ayas, which is this French city that is built at the intertidal zone, and it's for like 3 months a year it's underwater. And then when the tide goes out, it comes out again. So it just disappears and reappears, disappears and reappears. And to a certain extent, that mimics a lot of the types of conversations, at least I was experiencing on the internet. And this notion of asking people about home, this kind of very conversational mode of art production also had a bit of an accountability aspect to it. Right? Because you can't ask people how their day went and be really interested in and not kind of respond in a certain way when they tell you that, oh, my day sucks because of a certain particular thing, and then you're kind of invested. And for me, a lot of that time was about finding out where I was. Again, what's in your hyperlocal community, who's hurting, and why. And when I was living in Seattle, we learned about this detention center that was about an hour south, Tacoma Detention Center, and it had all the undocumented migrants that were coming in from various parts of the world, but they also were split up. So there's a detention center in California, and then there's a detention center that's only for adults in Tacoma. So what happens is families get split up, and then they don't really know, they can't communicate between detention centers, and then most of the time, when one of the other gets deported, or they have a status change, nobody else knows about it, and so they are left basically with their homes torn apart, sometimes irrevocably. So this was a march that I was part of that was all about like no more deportation, no mass deportation. It was organized by La Resistencia. And I was started doing a couple of pieces around that. And you'll see why this is important in a couple of minutes. I started thinking about the wind as a way to transport narratives. So if you thought about the wind, right? And if you've ever been on a sailboat, or when I was younger, I used to windsurf, right? So the wind is one of those ways that you go like, when the wind comes, that's where I'm gonna go in this direction. That's fantastic. So you wait for the wind, and then you kind of ride it, right? And then it pushes you in a certain direction. I thought about that very much in this very constrained, restricted environment, and I just thought, what if we started looking at the wind as a way to transport narratives. See, even if you were incarcerated, could you send a message on the wind in a particular way? But first, I was thinking, how many people are there in the detention center? What are the countries represented? So I created this site-specific installation right outside the detention center. They came over to ask me what I was doing for camera after that, but that was totally fine. Benign. It's an art project after all. But these arrows were all in the direction from that spot of the nationalities and their home countries that were represented within the detention center itself. At that point, I was also a volunteer in this detention center as a befriender, so they gave me that information. And in the gallery space, I had a device that calculated real-time wind data at Tacoma, and every time the wind blew in the direction of one of these, I would say, this is the countries that the wind is blowing towards. If you speak at that time, maybe your message might be able to travel back home. But another piece that I did, and this was a prototype at that point, was called Between Us a Breeze. And when you're a befriender in a detention center or some place of incarceration, you talk to somebody from a visitation booth, right? And this visitation booth is actually airtight. And I didn't even realize this until I went to the space itself. And I was trying to I spent quite a bit of time. I think maybe we did 3 or 4 months before I unfortunately had to leave Seattle, but about 3 or 4 months of weekly meetings in that detention center. And I was trying to understand why I couldn't form a relationship or a personal kind of relationship with the person I was talking to. And some of it, of course, was language, right? And some of it was circumstance, of course, that I totally understand. But I realized at a very fundamental level, it was also that we were not sharing the same air. And that the air of incarceration has a tremendous amount of weight on it. And whereas my relative air of freedom, per se, was vastly different. And so I thought about that, and I wanted to think about this conversation I was having between perhaps two conversationalists, but to stretch out that space between them and to see what could happen in there. So this is a piece called Between Us a Breeze, where as you talk to somebody across the visitation booths, your voice and your breaths are converted to gusts of wind that blow across this this reflecting pool. So this actually forms the basis of the work that I'm doing at PST, but I'll get to that in a minute. I was also very interested in the idea of narratives that were floating around, that were blown around by the wind, as I was, mentioning. Maybe we can speak, and then that voice will be traveling on the wind. So I created this simple kind of six speaker setup that is synced with fans as well. These real like laptop cooler, DC motor type fans. So they were timed in a certain way that if you stood in the center of it, you would hear the breeze at the same time you hear the sound come into your ear. And if the wind is actually covering, or as in it's actually surrounding you, that very breezy windscape that you heard was very strongly correlated to a soundscape that you heard, where narratives were kind of being blown around the space. I thought that was an interesting experiment. In this particular instant, not so effective, but but it happens, right? But one of the main things that happened in this piece was I started talking to undocumented migrants, and there are a lot of facilities around Seattle that actually help them. They allow them to remain anonymous, which is great, and they give them work. And so one of those times I went and I talked to this painter who was just expressing that, it's really tough when he's undocumented and he can't go back home to Oaxaca, but he wants his kids to have a good life as well. So, it's really, really tough navigating a lot of the issues in society, and also, him as an artist as well. He really recognized that the creative impulse is also very, very important in his everyday life. So I collected a couple of these narratives, and then I put it into a larger 16-channel installation. This time, this was presented in full in New Mexico as part of the Currents New Media Festival, and it had like about 24 fans and 16 channel speaker sounds. So if you can imagine, if you guys know about ambisonics, it's basically a sphere, and you're able to move points or sound signals somewhat arbitrarily from one side to the other side. And so the trajectory of movement, for me at least, mimicked the movement of people across the world. So if you flew, for instance, from, in my case, I guess, Singapore to Seattle, you would track a particular trajectory. And if I collected your narratives in this installation, your sound would move in that direction as well. And there would be fans that would be blowing that across to you, from source to sink. So this was a kind of image of the system in place, and there were fans, and so it was kind of mapping that out. These are the intensity of the fans that would go across. This is sped up slightly. And there was also a lot of whispers in there. So the idea that there's an undercurrent of whispers that goes across. Anyway. This is just to show you what was behind the scenes, or actually like what was playing on that base visualization. So I've also done it in a 4-channel setup. This is at the Stamps Gallery in Michigan. This is at Nuit Blanche in Toronto, where I also added in some Twitter thing, because I did a lot of Twitter at that time. And so I was like, okay, if you post your journeys, I'll record it and I will pull these narratives out. Okay. Worked a little, didn't work some. Okay. So the next project that was that came after that, not immediately, but after a while, was I got invited at some point to do a residency at a wind dome in Western University in London, Ontario. And apologies for the people who have already seen this work, because I present it quite often. I think, how many works do you have anyway? You're just like, this is it. But so in 2020, we went into the Wind Dome, and the Wind Dome is really, really interesting because it's the only place in the world where you can simulate a tornado. And the reason for that is because it's a dome, not a conventional wind tunnel that gives you a linear trajectory of wind. You can actually do wind in a 360-degree space. So you're able to create shears. You're able to create like crazy downwinds that actually knocked me off my feet once, and they had to turn it off and go like, "Are you okay?" And I was like laughing. I was like, do it again. But no, they did not do it again. They gave me a helmet, which was very emasculating. But but see, that's the kind of swirls that you could get, right? And so for my residency, I was really interested in saying, what if we got a team of dancers to come in and actually improvise with the tornado? Because this is the first and probably only space where you can be at the same scale as a tornado. So you can, improvise with it, and what would that look like? So there were a couple of conceptual underpinnings for it. You know, I spoke very much with an improviser, dancer. She's a professor at York, Prof. Susan Lee, who leads the York Dance Ensemble, did a lot of improvisational stuff. So we were, we were just playing with some ideas. Oh, how do you consider this idea of enwindment or embodiment of the wind? Are you embodied by the wind? Are you a sail? Are you, leaning against the wind? Or are you allowing the tornado to be, as she said, in your belly? What does that feel like? And what are corresponding motions that you can kind of adopt from it? So we created a series of prompts that were informed by some really interesting writing for Tim Ingle and, of course, Darcy Thompson as well, who wrote of the body as a diagram of forces, which was for us, very poignant at that point. And then COVID struck. And ironically, this, probably the most windy place on the earth, was also one of the most hazardous, because the wind, it turns out, did not leave the building. It was constantly recycled, and so it became impossible for us to be in that space. They had to shut down that space, and so our project basically got canned. But then we started thinking, what can we do? And so we did a series of experiments with dancers from the York Dance Ensemble, and we said, imagine yourself improvising with a tornado. We gave them the prompts, and then we said, okay, go for it, and record yourself in your homes doing it. And so we had a series of about 16 different students with really vastly different interpretations of what that interaction would be like. It was all really beautiful and really interesting. And there were some thematics as well, which I wouldn't really go through so much at this point. But because we couldn't also put any equipment in their houses, in their homes, in their personal spaces, we had to use these online mocap interpreters. This was Atlas. Oh no, it's not Atlas. I can't remember right now. Anyway, it was one of these AI-based mocap things where you put a video up and then they generate a skeleton with the different points. And we were so we collected a whole bunch of these, and then we put it in a different form. We put some particle systems in it. We hooked up all the points, and you get an image of people dancing, not so much with the wind, but as the tornado. And it was interesting for us that we put the dome at the base of it, and obviously the windy dome is not a dome that has any holes in it, but we were interested in seeing what if the windy dome had holes, and that the human became the scale of the tornado, and the human, or vice versa, the tornado became personified as a kind of person that was able to affect some kind of environmental level scale dance. There was sound as well, and I'll come shortly to that. This was actually there was no sound in that video per se, because we wanted to, or at least I was feeling like when I say tornado, you will definitely have a sound associated with that, right? And to me, that was like too easy, and to create a sound would be, I would have to fight against that kind of perception of it. So I just wanted to leave it up to interpretation. But this was another part of the project that was exhibited at the same time, where I created a score for wind that was coming through the shapes and folds of the dome. So I worked with one of the atmospheric scientists there, who was doing a lot of modeling of buildings within the dome itself. And so what they do is they create these wind patterns to show where where the wind actually goes when it strikes the building, so they know what the soft spots are, they know how to build like architectural infrastructure so that it gets prevents the building from swaying too much or hitting its resonant point and then buckling. And so I created a score that roughly mimics the way that the wind was going around a building. And these scores were actually played. It's just simple MIDI, and you could listen to them in the gallery space. But I started thinking about the ways that people during the pandemic could also access some of this really interesting new emerging tech, which I hadn't done before. And so at that time, I was working with a group called the Caribbean Canadian Artist Stars, and there's really very passionate group of Caribbean ladies, actually, who started the group, and they were doing a lot of workshops in the community, making sure that kids that grew up in Toronto still had a bit of semblance of the cultural identities. So this is a mask-making workshop that we're working on, but we were thinking, how can we actually use this technology to promote Caribbean dance? And so we did a couple of experiments, and we ended up with a kind of video montage of a dancer, and this is an avatar that she chose, talking about the Day of the Dead that they celebrate in the Caribbean islands, and how you could actually, there's actually sound to it, I think. Yeah, and that's culturally specific.
Is a tradition that can bring different age groups and different communities together.
And so we continued doing that, and we actually worked with a dance troupe, Kashi Dance as well. There's a lot of dance about the Caribbean diaspora, and to think about how we could utilize this system in that show. So one of the shows which I can't show, I can't present the documentation of, was a piece that had a ghostly image of a dancer who was ill, and so we had to record her in her home again, and she was able to dance with the troupe still, and that was her outline. Basically, they were all dancing together. Okay. So this is the piece that I'm presenting at PST, and thank you for your patience. It's taken me a while to get to this spot, but I hope everything that I've been doing kind of leads to this point, and I hope you'll see why. So the piece is called In Silence, and it basically has two main components. One is a video screen where there is an actor or actress who is doing a non-vocal performance of a story that you do not hear. And she's cycling through an emotional arc and only allowed nonverbal gestures. So in this piece, there are 3 stories, and these stories were developed from very close interviews or communication or conversations that I've had with my friends in the Jane Finch community in Toronto. And because I didn't want to extract these stories and kind of exploit the identities of the interviewees, I abstracted them into fictionalized narratives, but strongly referencing some of the stories and traumas that they have felt during the pandemic. And I've then transferred them on to actors and actresses who were then tasked with acting out these stories with nonverbal actions. So the work takes a selection of anecdotal stories and presents them through actors on a screen limited to non-vocal expressions and a reflecting pool that's activated by cymatic visualizations of their speech. Fragments of these stories are also accessible through a bone conductance reeling that forces the visitor into a position reminiscent of pain or anguish. Do you guys know what bone conductance is? Just real quick. So it's basically the idea that you're hearing sound, but not through your eardrums, the regular pathways. So you have these bone conductance headphones nowadays that actually sit behind your ear on the bone. So it transmits vibrations through your skull, and you're still actually able to hear it. It's a very interesting experience if you've never tried it. It's like you're hearing sound out of the ordinary. But it turns out, if you were to put your elbows on a transducer, the bone conductance would actually go through your elbow, and if you cup your ears, it will actually go through your bones in your arm and your fingers and activate your skull in the same way that the speakers would do. So this is kind of I just threw this in just now. This is like the installation view the first time it was up. This is at Connecticut College, and we're hoping that something like this comes up also in the CNSI building. So these are the bone conductance railings. You can see that's what you're supposed to do. And the reason why this piece is called In Silence, it's because of a quote from philosopher Salome Vogelin, who also happened to be my examiner actually in my MA. She says, "In silence, time does not move but vibrates gently on the spot. It is slowed down on my body whose time it has become." And I think a lot of us have felt that way during the pandemic, where time slows down so much that all you can do is just sit down and feel that time weigh on your body. And for a lot of people who are facing trauma as well, that's one point where, the trauma just amplifies so much more when you're just sitting with it. Okay. So these are just some more shots of the different kinds of patterns that have emerged from it. And I had a score, which I don't have it here, but there was a score that I wrote that mapped out emotional densities in the stories that I had written. And so when the actors hit those particular emotional notes, they were related to the strength of the vibrations, but also the frequency of the vibrations. As you can see, this is like I can't remember what the tone was, maybe 48 hertz, and it creates these widespread resonances across the entire pool because it hits probably some resonant frequency there. But those are more individualized, like 60 hertz tones, which just have more localized blooms. But the interesting thing about it also was that it's something that appears and disappears, which if you remember the well-worn adage, still water runs deep, right? You kind of understand that, like, if you talk to somebody, you would feel sometimes their stories are really embedded deeply within this weight of water. And, just going back to what I mentioned in the start about artists being able to show how you can be attuned to the issues of the world, it seems like our responsibility to bring these stories out to burst from the surface. So these oscillations of revelation and disappearance were something that I found very, very aligned with the experience of the stories in this neighborhood. So this was more, I think, successful part of the project. This was at Nuit Blanche in Toronto, which is an all-night festival. And so we had, upwards of 500 visitors in that space. It was awesome. But it was also interesting because in that sound itself, the narratives of the stories are actually piped in. So when you're sitting next to the pool, you can't hear the sounds. They sound like murmurings, like boom, 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 boom. There's a semblance of speech there. The prosody is somewhat similar. But you can only hear it if you listen to the bone conductance railings. But at Nuit Blanche, there was no railings. So it's interesting when we had a person who was visually impaired who came actually and put her hand in the water. And from that, she could actually feel the stories. And I think that goes to some of the ideas at the start when I was talking about memory machines and making memories and creating and embedding narratives within elemental media. And there's just so little that we have scratched the surface off. It's not just about storing in DNA. What if we were to, for real, like just be embedding stories within water? What would that be like? So I'm going to end with one last project. This was the most recent work that I've done. This is called Memory Machines Tuning. That was just put up in March. It was just put in March at the In-Situ Festival in Toronto, where the Small Arms Inspection Building is this really old, 100-year-old building where they used to inspect guns and firearms before shipping them out to the war in Canada's effort to help the Allied forces. And it's now been reconverted or converted into an art space. But so a lot of artists go in there and they work with the histories of that space. But there's also a lot of like infrastructure in there which is like falling apart and really, really interesting in that sense. So I went in that space and my prompt was like, what does lost sound mean for you? What does lost technologies mean for you? And so I worked with some of the stones, some of the bricks that were lying around in that space. But I also went to collect old cassette tapes. And cassette tapes are, I'm again dating myself, but it's not like this is reel to reel, right? No, so I didn't grow up during reel to reel, which is like the cool type of media archaeology. Like I grew up through cassette tapes, which you can still find today, but maybe they're making a bit of a comeback. So I asked for cassette tapes from everywhere, like Facebook Marketplace and like in that neighborhood as well, Mississauga, and I wanted to hear the stories within these tapes. And some of these tapes were tapes that had been left in answering machines, for instance, and those are really interesting when you kind of replay that. There was one tape that I had, which was an answering machine recording message, right? And in the past, what the recording machine would do is that it would have a 5-second recording of your introduction, and then it would loop it for the duration of the tape, right? And then every time it would play, it would record for 5 seconds, and then it would play, and then record for 5 seconds, and then play and then record for 5 seconds. So because this is a tape, if I wanted to see if any of those spaces included recorded content, I had to listen to the entire tape. So it was this Cantonese woman who was speaking in like a mix of English and Cantonese, asking you, well, I'm sorry, the Lees are not home, can you please leave a message? And I was listening to that over and over and over and over again. And in the end, that was all that I heard. There were no recorded messages on that tape whatsoever. But it was a very interesting experience, thinking about repetition as well, thinking about recall, and thinking about the way that these media store these contents, which if you don't really put the effort to source them, they would be lost entirely, right? So, but again, the point of memory machines was to think about the way that emerging technologies are now helping us remember, or are, dare I say, superseding our memories, right? How many of us use iCalendar to store all our notes now, or use our notes to kind of store every single vestige of communication we've ever had, right? And how many of us actually use our memory to remember the stuff that we're talking about? And so I wanted to make use of GPT, because LMMs are really LLMs are really important, and they're also critical for our future, and being able to understand them is really important for us, and understand their limitations as well, right? So I wanted to incorporate that somehow into this piece. And so I decided that I would think about radios. And when I was a kid, and I was in the car a lot, because my dad would drive me to school, and this was one of the best memories I have, actually, of a kid growing up, that we would talk in the car, and sometimes we would argue, whatever, but we would laugh, and we would listen to the radio. And there were radio stations that I can remember, that my dad would listen to, and I could remember my mom would listen to a particular radio station as well. And once you move out of that zone of coverage, you don't have those anymore, right? Sure, you can find another radio station that resembles the kind of radio stations that you listen to. The songs, they play the same songs, they have the same kind of vocal talent that runs the shows. But are you really remembering the radio stations, or are you remembering the instance of that communication? And how would you be able to ask GPT to remember that entire environment? I don't think you really can. So this is a 6-minute video, but I think we'll cut it at the maybe 3-minute mark. I think you'll get the point pretty fast. Yeah, let's see.
Don't understand. Tape is turning, the red button is down, the red light is on. There's no voice act. And now I'm just running this other tape just to double check and see if that would do as a second tape. It was not even a tape, it was just that I ran it in playback to warm it up.
và bèo cái gì nè ảnh cho theo xíu nè.
Mais vous regardez sur le sur mon ordinateur et ils ne changent pas leur... Je peux vous donner une petite place? Merci.
Okay. So, misses the point somewhat, but for other things, it's actually quite informative and very interesting. So this became a place where people could come in and actually read and actually observe a conversation somewhat with the machine. And for me, it was a process of reliving some of these memories, you know, asking it and seeing where I realized that my memory of it was stronger and where it could augment different parts of my search. Are you capable of surprise? Okay. So, thank you so much for your time. And I'll take questions.
Oh, that was really a tour de force. Wonderful.
Thank you.
It's always so great to see the whole spectrum because we've interacted in different points of it. But what I realized that I never asked you is why did you shift from science? There's a lot of students that I teach, you know, are science students that are thinking of shifting into art. They're unsure of it. It's happening more and more, actually.
Yeah, and you know, at the time after my undergraduate studies, I wasn't able to kind of see it in the way that I have in the trajectory that I've come, and you know, I do a lot of work now with science, so that's kind of me not really leaving the sciences, and so I'm still somewhat embedded within it. But at the time itself, you know, as most of us would also agree to, there were some courses that were just so freaking difficult that you just wanted to give up and not do it ever again. And for me, it was bioinformatics. It's ironic that I'm now a computational arts prof, but at that time I was failing every single bioinformatics class and statistics class that I was in, and I was telling myself, why, oh why are we doing ecology and life sciences and not actually going out in the environment? And instead we were spending tons of time in my honors year in a lab learning how to do statistics. I didn't understand it at the time. I recognize now it's actually really important to have models of the world. But the thing that stood out most to me in my undergrad studies were times where we used to go out and to understand biosemiotics. Our prof used to bring us out to the park and look at these roots that were growing above the surface and take a stick and hit them. And then he would say, these are signaling mechanisms not only for humans, but for non-humans as well. And he would say, well, there are different sounds here and there are different sounds over there. So depending on how this would grow, this would do different things and they would signal different things. And I was just amazed by the communicative potential in the natural world. And so actually for my my master's, when I started doing my master's of Symbiotica, my proposal to them was to do an acoustic ecology master's, which is, as you can imagine, acoustic and ecology is basically understanding the interactions of life forms and their functions related to sound. And also thinking about this nexus between man-made sounds and natural sounds and noise pollution and, you know, maybe the soundscape's getting worse, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So that was my trajectory. You know, I just kind of moved away from things that I was repulsed by, and then moved towards things that I was interested in, and here I am, and met amazing people in the meantime, and here I am.
So I was fascinated by your comments about the sound of the ear hearing itself, or the sounds that the ear membranes make while hearing. And I'm really interested in this because I think that, you know, once you called attention to it, and then you played the video, and then the video stopped, and I could still hear it. You know, and it's really fascinating to me when we are able to observe our own bodies being bodies, which is almost never, because most of the time I think that we are experiencing the world in an internal to external kind of trajectory and not always as sensitive to either our internal states or to perhaps the externality coming in. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the science behind that, and also maybe the music of hearing yourself hear.
So I think that the science behind that is basically a resonance in the eardrum itself, and all physical things vibrate in a certain way, and if you hit their resonant frequency, they vibrate sympathetically. And so it so happens that if you play a particular tone to the ear, you actually hear, it's a combination of tones. If you play a combination of tones to the ear, you would hear a third tone come out. And some people have called it the Tartini tone, but you know, it's not really sure if that tone is the right one for it. But basically, it's spontaneous autoacoustic emissions that are causing this third tone. And there's an artist called Jacob Kierkegaard who actually works with that, and it's very freaky actually, where he plays it. I think the ratio between the first frequency to the second frequency is like 1.2. So if you have like a 60 hertz tone, the next one is 75. And if you play those together, your ear would actually manifest a third pitch in the middle of those. I wish I had a demo for you right now, but I used to play it to my students and it freaked them out. But that's a very physical thing. So every space almost has an acoustic signature. And when I spoke to the people at the scientists at the Windy Dome as well, you know, they were telling me every building has an acoustic signature. And this coming from a scientist, you know, and talking to a musician, I'm like, of course, let's go. So that's one of it. I mean, the sound that's coming from the eardrum for that particular piece itself, again, we were interested in audification. So when I mentioned that I wanted to do acoustic ecology, as part of acoustic ecology, which is actually a musical movement, and maybe an environmentalist movement as well, but it's also one that is saturated with composers. And so they're thinking about acoustic ecology as a way to attune yourself to the sounds in the environment so that you could create music from it. And so when I was listening to this, my idea was that I would be on a sound walk on the eardrum. You know, if you were small enough to walk on the eardrum and you just take a walk around it, what would it sound like? And there will be vibrations that will be happening in different parts of it. There will be occasional rumblings. When it hits a certain frequency point, there would be a tone that comes out. And so that was what it sounded like for that particular one. But I imagine, you know, you could do tons of things to that once you had the source file.
Hi, Joel. So your trajectory was you started out as a scientist and then went into art. Do you have any advice for people going in the opposite direction whose background is in art and they're intrigued by the methodologies and the sort of rigorous research that you expect that people? I think there's like a lot of perceptions that that's more relegated to the scientific realm. So, and I think it's more common maybe to see people from science or tech backgrounds going into art rather than the other way around, or at least that's the perception because it's like more difficult or something.
Yeah.
And is that do you feel like that's the case, or is there like a lot of room for those blurry boundaries?
You know, I think there is room to do whatever it is that you choose to, and if you are passionate about something, I'm sure you'll find a way, right? But in my experience, this is a very interesting part of it. In my experience, as an artist, going into the spaces where art and science kind of collect and come together and try to navigate problems together, I have always found that art tends to be in service of science in general, where the scientist would be using the arts as a form of communication or as a form of like final output. And there's also a sense of like an envious sense where the artist is always like, well, let's ask the scientist if this is actually right. You know, and so this period of me kind of moving away from the sciences and establishing myself as an artist has also been in learning the confidence to be able to stand my ground and say that the arts has a legitimate position in knowledge creation. And so if you're already in the arts and you're going towards the sciences, I think, you know, my advice would be to find out in this particular notion, what kinds of knowledge can the arts provide? You know, whatever media that you have, what can it show science that science doesn't necessarily already have? If you talk about visualization, you know, what are the ways that arts can introduce multisensory modes of attunement that are different from what the science has at this point? And then when you go into the sciences, you know, you're bound to make some really innovative discoveries, and or you know, be one of those people that help to bridge the scientific and artistic communities, and to start thinking of them like you know, Victoria says, in a kind of third culture kind of sense. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I want to hear more about literature in your work.
In NUS, when I was an undergraduate, I was starved of the arts because we had there was no fine arts department. So the only access to dance that I had in my formative years were through ballet in the park, which was great. But because of that, I found myself turning to literature a lot. And I would read poetry, and I would be very involved with you know, effective responses to poetry whenever I had classes that had readings from a particular book or a particular chapter. I would be interested in, okay, what are artistic ways that we can represent it? Not just write a paper, but how could we be artistically attuned to what the, you know, this, and that always fell on like very kind of, you know, mood responses. I'm like, yes, that's cool to a certain extent, but really, what is the author trying to convey? Yeah, and so maybe it's because of that the most poignant poetic experiences for me come when I read things, and when I watch things, or when I see things, or even when I listen to things. Sometimes, I feel the kind of aesthetic attunement or aesthetic involvement, immersion, and that's great. But when I read stuff, it's when the ideas really start pouring in. So it's very seldom that I read a book, and I don't come up with like 10 ideas of something that I can fabricate from that particular experience. And I think it's really how I've been conditioned as a kid growing up.
So just to tag on to that, I've heard many of the science students say how they're starved for art and poetry, and even the word sacrifice is not allowed in research papers, right? So any mention of anything related to spirituality is kind of non grata, in science papers in particular. So I'm interested in, you mentioned, but just very briefly, that you collaborate with many different spiritual traditions. And it certainly is very meditative and work that goes deep into feeling the environment and sensing and trying to bring that to others. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that comes out of the world. I wouldn't say the world, actually. I would just generally the acceptance of very diverse systems of belief and very diverse modes of knowledge production at this point. And also a recognition that if we are going to be accountable to the environment, there are ways of thinking, ways of being, belief systems that have been in place for centuries that we can now learn from in order to help to mediate the climate crisis. And so along with that, has been this kind of shifting of, what I grew up as a Judeo-Christian, and actually was very active in my church, and I used to play a lot of music, but I was very frustrated with liturgy, as you will be. I was very frustrated with sermons. I hated them. I always leave. And then come back to play, it's like, what are you doing? But at some point, I realized that what I was looking for wasn't necessarily found within the conventional human understanding of text, and it needed to be something that was more universal. And I could feel that this thoughts were more richly conveyed in other religious forms, and I wouldn't say that one religion is better in certain cases, but I would be talking to people. I think was the main thing. Once you move away from religious institutions and start to talk to people, and then you understand that their belief systems are slightly different than yours, and then you try to find modes of resonances, you don't have to keep paying homage to this invisible, like, oh, this building or this kind of sect that I'm part of, this demographic, and exercise this idea, I guess this is an emerging notion of promiscuous care, which is, sounds like a bit like, are you sure? Well, as a teenager, I exhibited promiscuous care, and no, that's not what I meant. But it's more like thinking about an interspecies, more than human kind of existence, right? If you can extend the notion of care out of your familial structure, out of your religious structure, out of these structures that you've placed, how can you care for others outside of this zone, to be promiscuous in the sense that you would not only care for humans, but you would also care for non-modern human species, but also for like our technological apparatus. And what does that look like? I'm still trying to figure it out, right? But it's definitely not a single like religious system of belief.
Hey, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Proud of you.
We should leave this